Good morning. Welcome to the recording of Conscious Leadership and Mental Fitness. I'm going to pause the recording for now while I do some tech checks in the background, and we'll chat with you again very shortly. Okay, thank you for being here. I can see some faces that I know from around Adelaide. I can see some faces that I know from Queensland. I can see a face that I know from the US, and I don't even know what time it is there for you today, Scott, but thank you so much for joining us. It's really, really great to have you all here, and a big thanks to Matt Cesaro from LeadersHP for your time today too, mate. Matt and I have been working together for about 3 years now, and we met in the wellbeing and resilience space. So when I was lead trainer for the Wellbeing and Resilience Centre at SAMRI, Matt and I did a lot of work in developing the Train the Trainer program that they had for their resilience skills training. And we got to know each other quite well in that kind of psychological skills space. But Matt also has a history of over 20 years in the health sector, where he's worked quite extensively in organisational development and organisational change management. And he's got a few stories himself around how he has shifted from maybe, a bit more of unconscious leadership to more of an evolving, growing conscious leadership style. He works very firmly in that leadership space now. So most of his work is around informing strategy for organisations and really delving into some training programs and deep work for their leaders on how they can make positive change and positive impact through their businesses. So thank you so much for being here, Matt. And I just want to throw over to you by way of anything else you want to let these good people know about yourself today.
Yeah, thanks, Beck. Thanks for the invitation to have a conversation about this stuff. And for those of you who've taken time out to be here, and for those who are watching this online, I hope you enjoy the conversation as well. And it's good to see a few familiar faces and names, and also some new ones. So thanks, Beck. I think you've covered the background reasonably well. And I just wanted to share today some of my own experiences and insights around this thing called consciousness. I just had a quick joke with my business partner before that, I've shifted from being unconsciously high-performing to now consciously underperforming. So we'll talk about that shift of from being unconscious to conscious and why it's so important. So great to have you all on the call, and look forward to the conversation today. As Beck said, we do a bit of work in this space, and it's a word that we actually use when we're working with organisations and connecting leadership capability to strategy. It's actually part of our purpose statement, lifting consciousness of leadership, which sounds kind of grandiose, but there's something quite grounded in it. And when Beck said, let's have a conversation about conscious leadership, I thought, well, yeah, that sounds like a great idea. And then I thought about it for a second. I thought, geez, what should we cover? If you think about the span of something like consciousness, it is so broad, isn't it? So maybe, Beck, I'll just give a bit of context as to where I was thinking we could come from this today.
I'm really curious about what your definition of consciousness, and how would you define conscious leadership?
Yeah.
That's a good place to start.
Share some of my insights through that. And I guess, when we've had to think about what we mean by the word consciousness in our work, you think about the definition of it, being aware of something, or responding to surroundings, or having knowledge of something. It's part of it, but we really focused also on what it means about our internal response to what's happening outside of us is a big part of consciousness as well, a big part of our definition. So the way I really like to sum it up is, asking the important question, what's happening right now? So if I was to define consciousness, it's the awareness to ask the question, what's happening right now? That sounds really simple, but there's, again, many layers to that, isn't there? So if we think about self, we could ask the question of self, what's happening for me right now? So that might be, well, what's happening for me right now as I'm sitting on the screen and talking to people and about to go into this conversation and wanting it to be really impactful and productive and useful and all the stuff that's going on for me right now. And there's my behaviour in that. What's going on for them right now is another way. So others, there's Beck, I can see Scott and Bud and a whole bunch of other names on the call. So there's another question there. All of us, what's happening for everyone right now? So extending it to the group, to the collective, whatever that looks like. And then there's also the systems that we operate in. And that could be family, organisation, it could be society, it could be global. What's happening in the system right now, or in those systems right now. So there's those layers, if you imagine them like concentric circles expanding out, and within that, we've got the external and the internal. So what's happening that I can see and experience, the stimulus I take in, and what's happening on the inside that can't be seen for myself and for others and the system. Then there's different perspectives, my perspective, your perspective, third person perspective. So all these layers and levels of consciousness that if we were to answer the question of defining it, we'd probably go into all those different segments and we'd be here for about 3.5 weeks probably. So for the purpose of today, Beck, what I thought was where we could potentially focus and giving the links back to, leadership and mental fitness, really focusing on that first circle, that first layer of self, and what my experience with that has been, and what we know about this space of developing self, inside out, as we call it. And that also helps us to understand others. So understanding compassion, love, these things can only genuinely and wholeheartedly be offered to others if we offer them to ourselves first. And that's the inside out leadership mantra that we hold, and why we work with individuals from the inside out first. So that helps us to influence others in a positive way as well. So for the definition of consciousness, that's where I'd like to play today.
Yeah, nice. So playing to that, if we think about some of the kind of internal thought processes that go along for leaders, and or the behavioural traits that you see in conscious leaders, could you speak a little bit to some of that kind of that self stuff that happens for leaders who are working in a more conscious way?
Yeah, and I think another way of framing that back too is, what are we seeing in conscious leaders, both in terms of behaviours and what drives that behaviour in terms of their thinking patterns, that get us and get them out of autopilot. So, the being on autopilot, if you think about, the way our habits, our patterns, our ways of behaving, our ways of leading, the way we even define leadership, that drives our stories around whether we're effective or not as a leader. So there's all of that going on. So getting off of autopilot is the ability to really tune in and become more conscious, as opposed to unconscious, to what's driving our bus. And I know for me that this really came into light for me, particularly in the latter part of my career in government, and certainly trying to then make a transition into starting a business. And if anyone's been through that kind of significant transition of identity, you'll know how shaky that can be, and the level of conscious awareness you need to start bringing to the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves. So I want to share, a few ways of framing that. So first of all, behaviourally, why it goes beyond self-awareness. And I'm sure you've all, had experiences in developing self-awareness. It's a lifelong journey. We think about self-awareness, our preferences, our behavioural traits, our strengths, areas for development, the values, our interests, all of these things are part of this piece of diving further into self-awareness. Consciousness for me, or consciousness for us, is about how do we bring that self-awareness and that knowledge and understanding into the present moment. So how do we combine presence right now with that sense of knowing? And that's really what we talk about consciousness in terms of behaviour. It's the ability to bring that into the here and now through the question of asking, what's going on right now? So the way we can sort of unpack that might be, what does that look like in demonstration, behaviourally, as a leader? 3 C's. We love doing things in threes. The brain remembers things in threes. Like that's neuroscience. It's why I remember phone numbers the way we do. So for a lot of these things, I've tried to narrow it down to 3 things. So behaviourally, 3 things. So one is curiosity. So this is the one about shifting from judgment, which is a natural human response. Anyone who says they don't judge isn't actually human. So a natural human response is to make sense, meaning, and judge as quickly as possible. What we want to be able to do, though, is notice and shift from judgment to a little bit more compassion and understanding. Curiosity is what helps us to do that. So through asking what's going on, what else might be going on, What else am I not seeing? What else am I not noticing? So curiosity is one of those behavioural traits that conscious leaders really have. They stay in curiosity and ask lots and lots of great questions around what could be going on, what else could be going on. Another one is courage. So we talk about courage, 3 C's, the second C of courage, to step into discomfort, to show vulnerability, to see where there's tension and conflict, and understand that that's actually a doorway to something that's unresolved. There's something in there that's actually quite valuable for us, that can often free up stuck energy. So often creativity and the opportunity flows out of tension and conflict. I'm sure you've all experienced that before. I know you have too, Beck. So, courage is one to go there, as we say. We see that in conscious leaders, the understanding. I'll talk a bit more about fear in a minute, but understanding what that's about. And the third one I wanted to offer was around clarity. What can we do next? So particularly when we're sitting in high levels of uncertainty and complexity like we are now, letting go of the need to have all the answers, but identifying what's the next right step, or what's the first step we can take. So a sense of clarity around that, or for a conscious leader, it might be simply, what's the next step I need to take to calm my farm, soothe my system? Do I need to anchor? Do I need to breathe? What is it I need to do right in the here and now before I can determine the next step? So often it's that really simple stuff that we often overcomplicate. So when talking about conscious leadership, bring those things into the here and now. I was going to talk a bit about high-performing teams and how that flows into that, but maybe I'll park that for a sec.
It's a great point though, like you're talking about curiosity, courage and clarity, as I've put in the chat box for everybody as an anchor to remember that. And I think that if we think about those times where we've been part of high performing teams, or the opposite, if we've been part of a team that's not performing very well, we can probably see how those traits have or haven't played out. I mean, for instance, when I was working in a team that was quite dysfunctional, I can remember that there was this rigidity in people's thinking. So there was no curiosity about, oh, I wonder what's going on for them. It was just very much about, this is how it should be and this is how it needs to go. And there was that real kind of staunch hanging on to, this is how I want it to go. And there wasn't that natural curiosity, and there was no leaning into the discomfort of having a courageous conversation about the curiosity of what else could be going on. And so hence there was no clarity. So if you think about sometimes how we've seen things play out in the negative, sometimes we get clear on what we do want from seeing what we don't want. And that's why for the mental fitness work that I teach in, there's that balance between, okay, there's strength, but sometimes you can be so strong that you're rigid, and you start to lose out on those beautiful things around compassion and curiosity and leaning into the discomfort. So I think that, even if we do park that conversation for now around high performing teams, we've all got a natural sense of how that will actually work to our advantage if we are wanting to increase our performance.
Yeah, it's great, Beck, and because it's kind of counterintuitive when you think about it. The way the brain works, actually searching for certainty and meaning as quickly as possible. So curiosity to not rush to a conclusion around something, even if it's an interaction with another human being, it's a little bit counterintuitive. We actually get a rush of dopamine when we find certainty, even if we make it up. And even if the story is not even the story that has a happy ending. It's kind of weird, really, right? So we make up stories that don't have happy endings, but we feel better because we've got a sense of certainty around it. You've only got to look outside in the society right now to see that play. So, yeah, it's really interesting. It sounds easy. Be curious, stay curious, ask questions, be courageous, but easier said than done. And that's part of the practices we'll talk about a bit later on.
Yeah, it's that in the moment stuff, isn't it? And you spoke to fear as well, which I think, fear is a very natural go-to for the human brain. Fear kicks in because there is a sense of, I need to survive and I need to survive this situation, whether there's a real or perceived threat to my safety. And that's not always about physical safety, is it? That can be around social safety as well. And do I fit into this group here? Do I belong in where I am? And fear can be triggered by so many different things that then leads to, because if fear is the instinctual way that we go, for me, that really speaks to why we do need to be conscious, because we need to remain aware of when fear is starting to kick our butt and we're just leaning into instinct rather than transcending that evolutionary instinct and going beyond ourselves to go, oh, actually, what's the bigger picture here? This is not about a threat to my survival. This is actually about making this group, making this team, making this situation work better, not just about my reactivity. So is there something that you wanted to kind of come back to around that concept around fear?
Well, you framed it beautifully. It does all link, interestingly enough, fear links to a high-performing team. So you talked about dysfunction, and we've all worked in teams that are really high-performing and humming, and teams that are completely dysfunctional. And through my career, I worked in many, and that's where my fascination around this stuff kind of really sparked around, is that just by chance? Is it just kind of by luck, the kind of people that you're in? Whether it's, when I coach sporting teams, so is it just about the people you have? Is it about the leader? Is it about what personality styles? What is it? Well, the fear is linked because what we know about high-performing teams is there's an underlying foundation of something that always needs to be in play first, and that's trust and psychological safety. There are many studies, many models. You know, Patrick Lencioni's got a great model around this. Google's study around Project Aristotle and psychological safety. So high-performing teams have a foundation of trust and psychological safety. Now that makes a fair bit of sense, right? But as a conscious leader, I guess where the fear thing comes in is you can't create trust in a team without giving it away to other people. And a leader's role in a high-performing team is often to go first when there's risk and uncertainty and emotional exposure, which is essentially Brené Brown's definition of vulnerability. So leaders going first, we can't, one of my mentors sort of uses the phrase, you can't sell what you don't have in stock. You know, you can't preach what you don't practice. Good afternoon. I forget which cat's name that one is.
This one's Eddie.
Eddie. Good to see Eddie.
If we're preaching what we're practicing, I'm practicing love right now.
Eddie's got a bit more further than last time I saw Eddie. So where was I? Trust, that's right. So leaders have to go first. So what we're talking about here, the link to fear is, well, if trust is required, trust requires empathy and compassion. We can't demonstrate true empathy without vulnerability. And we can't demonstrate vulnerability without experiencing fear. So it's all kind of linked together, and conscious leadership is really about also developing our relationship with discomfort and fear. Understanding it's natural, it's a human response, it's not something to push away or to manage. It's that whole piece around the fine line between anxiety and excitement. You know, I remember when I first understood this, I think it was some of the conversation we'd had back, and I was driving to one of my very first gigs as a consultant. Absolutely, what's the technical term? Shitting bricks. Because I found out just in the morning of the session that it wasn't going to be a group of 10 leaders, there was a misprint, and it was 100 leaders. And I was on my own going into this forum thinking, well, this nice small group, I've visualised it in my mind, it's going to be awesome. And I've walked into this auditorium full of people. So the drive there was only about 5 to 10 minutes. And I remember the experience of being behind the wheel, and what came over me in that moment of this rush of anxiety, but then I started to laugh out loud because I started to remember this conversation that we'd had around this piece around anxiety and excitement being the same vibration in the body. And the emotions that we get are just vibrations in our body that last for 1 to 2 minutes. And it's only the brain that starts to tell us something about it that determines where it goes from there, right? So I just started to go, this is going to be a pretty awesome opportunity to see what happens. Because I'm scared shitless right now. So what an experience this is going to be. It's a really, really simple moment, but interesting. That was something that came up for me around a story I tell around reframing anxiety into excitement. Because fear's there. Fear's always there, whether it's those moments of being in front of a group, being seen, or bringing a team together and having a different conversation. So high-performing teams need leaders to embrace that a bit.
It's about, I guess, not being victim to your emotion. It's about recognizing that your emotion is an indicator, you know, that your emotions are there to guide you rather than to trap you or punish you. You know, I think that there's a lot of fear that people have around fear and a lot of fear that people have around other emotions as well, which is not necessary. What are some of the ways that you help leaders to be able to be more aware of their emotional state and to have a healthier relationship to their emotions? You know, what are some of the things that have come out in practice for you?
Yeah, I was probably thinking about, you know, if we look at the behaviour as the external piece and what we're experiencing and the emotions we're experiencing, what we, I guess, try to do is work backwards from there. So working backwards from there means what's creating the state, what's creating the physical state that we're in, what's creating the emotions that are coming up for us. And it all starts with story. It all starts with thought. It all starts with what our brains is interpreting from the stimulus it's receiving, right? So if we come back to that, that's often where we start. Yes, there's need to get comfortable with different emotions and developing vocabulary around that, but the inside out piece always starts with the internal story and understanding ourselves, the self-awareness piece of what drives our story and where does that come from and how does that then interpret situations that we're in. So ways we do that is probably, again, I think it's three that I've sort of picked out. One is becoming the narrator, as I say, and the narrator of our story, if you like. So conscious leadership in this sense is asking the question, okay, what's going on right now, but what's the story I'm making up? What's the story I'm creating? What's the story I'm telling myself? What am I thinking about myself in this moment? Any trigger that we have, be it a stress response, a trigger, fear, anxiety, is not about the external stimuli, it's about our story interpreting that. And yes, there are threats and external threats that we naturally respond to, as you alluded to before, Beck, but 80 to 90% of our threat responses are made up. We're born with a fear of loud noises and falling, and all the rest of them are inherited. So what's the story that I'm making up about this situation that I'm in? What's the story I'm telling myself about who I should be as a leader that's impacting myself and how I see myself right now? So the narrator is such an important one, and particularly in leadership, I held a leadership archetype of being the resilient warrior hero, that just could push through and would go to places that no one's been before, cue epic battle music, and that was my story about leadership. And that led me to some great successes and high performing outcomes, but it also led me to burnout and divorce and a whole range of other things. So understanding what are the stories that drive our behaviours, really important one, number one. Meaning making, so I think another part of conscious leadership thinking is intentionally searching for meaning, be it in retrospect, what did I learn, what did I gain, what has shifted as a result, or in the moment, what will I learn in terms of my story I shared before in the car, what will I learn and gain from this because I'm shaking right now. But that ability to find meaning as quickly as possible, seeing growth as uncomfortable yet necessary. And the last one, which is kind of an interesting one, is what we call impermanence. So conscious leaders have a really good relationship or reminder of that everything is temporary. And this too shall pass, essentially, as the mantra. And that links to that conversation we just had before, Beck, about emotions lasting for about 90 seconds in the body until we start telling ourselves things about them. So there's probably three that I would highlight from an internal thinking point of view.
Yeah, nice. I'm just typing those into the chat for people as another reminder as well. So from your perspective, would you say, because I'm looking at the leadership piece in the context of mental health at the moment and thinking about it for myself, do leaders who master these concepts, do you feel like they tend to have better psychological well-being than leaders that don't?
Yes.
And is that, it might be a chicken and the egg proposition, but do you think that better mental health comes as a result of going through these processes? Or do you think that people who are mentally healthier are more likely to engage in these kind of processes?
Yeah, they're absolutely, what's the word, symbiotic in that relationship, and they're interdependent. And I mean, obviously as much about this too, Beck, in terms of not just psychological well-being, but I guess I would talk to well-being more broadly than that, and psychological can't be seen independent of physical and physiological. As we know, they're strongly connected. So where I would go with that is, when we talked about self-awareness before, And often we focus on self-awareness when it comes to our sort of behavioural traits and our preferences and even understanding our thinking. But self-awareness also connects to our understanding our own unique physiology. So what happens in our bodies and what's going on for us in terms of our well-being. Our body is our greatest source of knowledge when it comes to giving us insights and data around what could be going on. And that's different for every person. So another layer of self-awareness we often overlook is what is it we know about ourselves that shows up in our bodies when we're maybe not, we're not doing the things we need for our own well-being, psychological and physical. So I guess a few things that we focus on there that could be useful. Hello, gorgeous. I'm not sure what time it is there, but it looks either really late or really early.
It's past bedtime. Don't tell her mom.
Okay.
11
It's bedtime.
Don't tell mum. Love it. Love it.
He was looking at the weather in Australia on the weather app earlier.
Nice.
Depending where you're coming from, Bud's part of the world is probably slightly nicer than us down here in down south.
I'll show you what the weather's like right now.
Yeah, thank you, Bud.
Bud.
Oh,
Wow.
Anytime.
Yes.
South Australia is raining, Queensland is shining, and New Jersey is probably very dark.
Yeah, the sun is out, but it's nowhere near as warm as it would be up in Bud's part of the world. Thank you for sharing. What were we talking about? I do that all the time. What were we talking about? Oh, that's right, strategies. So a few things around well-being that we tend to focus on. So one is actually understand. So let's flip it. When we think about well-being, what impacts well-being the most? We think about stress. We talk about stress. So one of the first points around stress that we work with is actually understanding the utility of stress. So getting to learn a bit about stress. Because when you hear the word stress, think about what comes up. Think about your definition and your reaction and the story you've got around stress. So reframing that a little bit is kind of a great first step. Understanding more deeply around how does stress actually work in the body? How is it useful for performance? So we cannot be at peak performance without levels of stress and cortisol and the reaction that's in our body. It's why we obviously can react. Our bodies react when we're under threat because stress is increased. So there's a performance element to stress that's really important to understand. Also, the way we think about stress impacts our well-being. Kelly McGonigal's talk is a great one for that, talking about studies into people's thinking about stress and how much it impacted their health. So that's the first part we start with, is understanding and acknowledging stress as utility. The second one is then understanding our stress triggers. So what are the triggers and also the early warning signs that we maybe are under some sense of stress that's impacting our well-being, or maybe we're just under stressed, or we're not stimulated enough, and we're feeling apathetic and bored. Often it's the first one that catches people more so. There's too much stimulus, there's too much going on, too much to do, not enough time, not enough space for myself. So all of our stress triggers can be a little bit different. I know for me, Beck, and you've seen this probably many times, my energy flow over the course of the day. So I'm pretty much at my best now. It's all downhill from here in the afternoon. But if I find myself early in the day, cognitive fatigue, cloudy, unable to make decisions, I start to feel, I get redness here as well, and I start to feel temperature rising, even if I'm in a cool place with lots of water. So I notice that in my body. I notice that I'm far less calm in my responses. So, Beck, you've got a couple of examples for you of what shows up when you're in that sort of what we call the yellow zone of stress.
Yeah, and I really like how you've made that link between, not pulling apart the mind and the body, but seeing the psychology and the physiology as all being integrated, because I might not be psychologically stressed at all. I might feel really fine, but for me, it's more if I have worked through too much, if I've done too much work in a week and I'm not having had enough downtime, I'll get shaky hands and feel completely fine psychologically. I feel clear, I feel, well, but I get that shake in my hands. And if I push past that, then I notice that then I start to feel the psychological signs. Then I start to get a bit grumpy and I start to get a bit vague, and it starts to affect me mentally. But that's the first kind of physiological sign that maybe my fight and flight system is starting to become a little bit more overactive, and I need to do something to rebalance it. So it's a good marker that if that kicks in, then my mental state is about to take a downward turn as well.
Yeah, great. Yeah, and again, thinking about what are those early signs? It's not something we think about it that often. Often that's when we're kind of in that red zone and the lights are flashing and we've come to a complete standstill or crashed, that we take action. So conscious leadership in this sense is about what do you notice along the way that's giving you a sign to slow down or whatever it is you need, which is point number 3. So knowing what you need and asking for what you need or claiming what you need. When you're noticing those signs, and this again can be a little bit counterintuitive to leadership. It's a new way of thinking about leadership, to actually ask what you need, whether it be rest, time out, space to recharge. And what this does though is creates insight. It creates space, generative thinking, creativity. So knowing what you need to bring yourself back into the high performing zone is really important as well. So that flows on to teams. We need to role model what we're asking our teams to do as well. And the benefit of this in leadership is sustainable teams. We can role model this stuff for our teams. Yeah.
There's a lot of unspoken communication that happens with that. Something that's happened for me is that I will tell myself now to give myself the permission to take care of myself. And it can be very hard when you're in a team with a leader who's not role modeling that, as you said, because I remember being in a situation where our manager was telling us, you need to go home, don't stay, don't do the overtime, like just, go home now, you guys need to rest, look after yourself, have a good weekend. And yet she was the person who was staying in the office overnight, and, we were finding packets of chips on the floor because she'd slept under her desk, and it was just working herself to the bone, picking up everything that she probably didn't need to. But because she was doing that, we all felt an imperative subconsciously to work harder, because that was the standard that she was setting. She might have been saying to us, you need to look after yourself and you need to go home now. But in watching her behavior, it was kind of like, oh, well, she's not walking that talk. So actually what she expects of us is to be working really hard and working overtime as well. So I think that there's a real difference that we need to be aware of in what we say to our people and what we're actually role modeling, which is a really great point.
Yeah, absolutely. That's right. And because well-intentioned, well-meaning, empathetic people will mirror the behaviours of the leader, whether they realise it or not. And we work with senior teams and leadership teams and executive teams. That's one of the first questions we ask is, after working with the senior leader, we ask the question of how is that playing out in the dynamics of the group? And often it's there, but people haven't seen it before. And it's like, oh, now we can see what's happening. So, such an important part of role modelling what you want. And one of the benefits of conscious leadership in creating sustainability.
Yeah, because it's really about being able to perform highly over the long term. You can do a really strong push to try to get stuff done now, but if that's going to then impact you over the medium to long term, then sustainability is really the issue there.
Yeah, thinking about it in terms of, so we talked about stress before, so higher levels of stress can actually help us in peak performance, but have a much shorter useful life. So it's not about achieving this equilibrium all the way along. It's probably about noticing where are we right now as a team, where am I individually, how long can I be here, and what do I need more or less of? Absolutely. So it's always in dynamic flow.
Yeah, absolutely. Which is what I talk about when I'm coaching mental endurance skills. What do you put in place so that you can sustain this performance over the long term? It's not just about, showing your, robustness and your strength in that moment, but it's that, how do you ride the peaks and the troughs to play the long game, right?
Yeah.
So we've got another 10 minutes or so. So I just want to put out a call for anybody who's got any questions to feel free to pop things into the chat. Or if you've got any questions that you want to ask in person verbally as well, feel free. But what else did you want to touch on in these last 10 minutes, Matt?
Yeah, cheers, time flies. I think what I wanted to sort of touch on was some of the practical ways, like how do we develop how do we focus? You talked before, how do we work with leaders in this space, and what are some of the practical ways we can develop this consciousness piece? And, you know, in terms of leadership, there's a great Bob Adams quote, you know, when you think about organisational transformation, that it cannot happen without a preceding transformation in the consciousness of the collective leadership. So what that means is collective leadership firstly. So leadership is a team sport, and that's the shift we're seeing in leadership, that sense of it's not about the hero archetype leader, but actually about embracing collective leadership groups and how do you lift consciousness of groups. And that's what our work is really, really about. Some practical ways that we want to talk about, cultivate self-awareness. So self-awareness coupled with that in the moment question of what's happening, but self-awareness primarily strengths, weaknesses, values, motivations, fears, stories. Who are the people and what are the things that have influenced the way you see the world and make meaning? The more of this we understand for ourselves, the more questions we've got to ask others and help to unpack what could be going on for them in the spaces we're in. So cultivating self-awareness, reflective practice, number 2. So, you know, finding space for observation to observe our thoughts, our feelings, meditation if that works, or other mindfulness practices. In the space, in the stillness is where the clarity can surface. Also improves our sleep and our brain functioning and some of those things as well, but finding space for that reflective practice. For some people, that's also about reaching out and having support networks and having those reflective conversations. So whether it's peer mentoring or otherwise, but find space to ask reflective practice questions, and we might be able to provide some guiding questions after the call that could be useful. Seek alignment. So seek alignment with what's important and prioritise that, focusing on growth over comfort. I know for me, the minute I was able to grab a hold of that sense of discomfort is going to be the price of admission for what I really want, it shifted my whole mindset around things that I find uncomfortable ultimately. So seeking alignment with that. And the last one is around radical responsibility. You know, we work on taking full responsibility for yourself in any given moment. What does that look like as a practice? It's really unpacking, well, how did I show up here? You know, what influenced me, and essentially how did this come through me and out of me, as opposed to just focusing on the external world, of other people and other things. So these are all practices, and they're all interdependent. They're not in isolation from each other. That can really dial up our level of consciousness as to ourselves and those around us.
Coming back to that point that you've made around developing our self-awareness and those reflective practices, would they look like a combination of individual practices? Like I would go and do some journaling or some reflecting, you know, kind of internally, as well as getting people to offer me feedback?
Yeah, absolutely, Beck. So, you know, this where the first, second, third person perspective comes in as well. So from the first person, anything you're doing that is your own reflective practice is coming through, you know, through your lens and through your interpretation, isn't it? Then there's the practice of doing that, which for some is writing. Thinking is useful, writing is even more useful, talking through can be even more useful. You know, depending on your preferences around those things as well, there are all different ways to do it. Seeking feedback, again, brings in that second person perspective. So really valuable of being able to help other people see you in a different way. Similar to when, you know, you see someone else and you ask their perspective around what's going on. It's a way of closing a gap between what you perceive and what they perceive. So you're absolutely right. Different practices, one ways to do that, and bringing other people in can be a great way to broaden your perspective around what you're noticing and what other people are noticing going on.
Yeah. And you talk about that sense of taking radical responsibility as well.
Easier said than done.
I was going to ask how easily that's taken up by people, you know, and, you know, is there often, you know, like the ego mind starts to push back against that? You know, how much of a tussle do you see when people are in the midst of, you know, that kind of process?
Yeah, well, I found myself in this situation with myself, you know, literally a couple of weeks ago when, because I'm more conscious, I was absolutely aware of what was going on in terms of my thinking. I was in a bit of a hole, in a pit, and I was literally having this internal argument of, well, you know, you need to take responsibility for what's going on for you and bring yourself out of that. And the other voice going, well, no, I just want to feel like shit. I'm going to stay here for a bit longer. And this internal struggle that was going on inside of me I'm observing what's going on in this, which is really interesting. So we talk about it, and I'm not certainly talking about it as someone who has this mastered, because it's not that easy. What we're asking though is, what we're asking of ourselves and others in leadership is, if you sat with the question in any given moment, what do I have complete responsibility over, and what am I willing to take responsibility for? That ultimately is the question we're challenging people to sit with. But it is challenging. If you sit someone down and say, if I said to you, Beck, everything in your world right now is yours and your fault, it's confronting. It really is confronting to hear that, particularly when we've all had experiences in our life that are really challenging. So it's not about assigning things as black and white, or as binary, or as right and wrong, but just really challenging ourselves to say, what can I take more responsibility for myself in terms of, the outcomes that I'm getting ultimately.
Yeah, thank you. We've just got a minute or two left, so feel free, if you're here, to put in some contributions. Thank you, Bud. I love how Bud has just said in the chat, interesting how our brains get hooked on feeling shitty.
Yeah.
Triggers the same reward centers. Like Gautier's song, you can get addicted to a certain kind of sadness. It's very true, because I can see Bud kind of dancing along to the melody in his head at the moment, which is great. But it is true. We can start to, and you and I, Matt, in our teaching, we often talk about neuroplasticity and the pathways that get anchored in our brains, and some of them become like superhighways. So it can be very easy to flick into those modalities, and then quite hard to recarve a path, which is what we both do in the work that we're in. In closing, and again, people, you are more than welcome to throw a question in at this point, but just one thing I wanted to ask in leading towards our wrap up, Matt, is if you were to kind of put it in a nutshell, why is conscious leadership important? Why would we do any of this? Why would we make the effort to improve our consciousness as leaders?
I think for me, Beck, it's a question that every person would answer differently. I think for me, it has to come back to purpose. It has to come back to, for you, ultimately, what is it that you're seeking and what's really important to you? And I don't think we can strive to move towards our purpose and be aligned with our consciousness, particularly as our world becomes more and more complex. And if we want to do more than just survive and get through and cope, but actually thrive and have an impact, and for me there's a strong purpose piece around that, then what I know of this work is it's every day gives me a sense of being able to get up and feel like I'm aligned with that. So it doesn't mean we get it right. It doesn't mean we always feel like we're moving in directions we want, but I think for me it's about being able to do more than just survive in times of complexity that, for me, I don't know about you, aren't going to be getting simpler. So that's what it's about, and that's certainly what we talk about here.
Alignment with purpose. I love it. And I couldn't have said it better myself. Thank you so much. There's an event that LeadersHP is hosting next week, isn't there? It's called Finding Your True Voice, which is about helping leaders to kind of step up into this space. Can you tell us a little bit about that? And I'll send everybody a link to that event for next week when I send you the recording too.
We actually don't run a lot of programs in the public space. Most of our work is done in organisations within TAC teams, but we do like to offer these things occasionally. But my business partner, Mia Hanshin, with a friend and colleague of hers, Gemma Munro, is a PhD in performance psych and has worked sort of around the world as a speaker. Those two are combining, so it's a pretty magic cocktail for a couple of hours, having a conversation around finding your true voice. So confidence, courage, conviction to speak your truth. Some of the things we talked around today, around stillness and discover what's important to you, and how to speak from your heart, how to trust your gut. Really how to bring your voice out into the world around things that are important to you, be it in your context of a leader in a team, or more broadly than that. So a lot of really good stuff in there, and some really anchored daily practices that can help with that as well. So there's still a few spots there available, and that'll be a great session.
Yeah, nice. I'll send everybody a link to that as well, because I think it would be a nice way to be able to implement some of the things that we've spoken about and put them into practice in that kind of masterclass setting. So thank you, everybody. Thanks so much for your time, and congratulations on taking some time out for yourself to sit and contemplate and to ponder on what it might be to step up in terms of consciousness, maybe for yourself or for the leaders that you work with as well. Thank you so much for your thanks coming through as well. Go well, everybody. Thank you, Matt, for your time. I so appreciate it. And you'll all receive a recording later on today. Keep an eye out for that and really appreciate your time once again. Go well, be well, and look after yourselves and each other, and we'll be in touch.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Beck. Thanks for joining us.
Much appreciated all. Ciao for now.